Hi, this is Daniel Webster. I'm Bloomberg Professor of American Health and Violence Prevention at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where I direct the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Policy and Research. Now let's talk about the overall impact of gun violence in the United States. And we'll start with mortality data. There are nearly 40,000 firearm-related deaths in the United States as of 2017. That's slightly more than a number of people who die in motor vehicle crashes, but still less than the overall number of deaths connected to drug overdose. Let's take a look now at how these firearm deaths break down by intent. What many people do not appreciate is that the large majority of deaths from firearms in the United States are suicides, 60%, in fact. 37% of firearm deaths are firearm-related homicides, leaving very small percentages, roughly 1%, in the categories of legal intervention. These are deaths typically of law enforcement officers shooting individuals. I must say with an important caveat that the data here coming from death certificates do not accurately capture that. So some of those deaths may actually be miscoded as homicides rather than legal intervention. There are also a small number of deaths that are from unintentional shootings or undetermined intent. These are cases in which medical examiners or coroners, those who fill out death certificates, could not determine what led to the gunshot. Here in this table, we break these deaths down also in comparison to the number of people who are treated in hospitals for non-fatal gunshot wounds. And there's a very different kind of distribution between fatal and non-fatal woundings that you see in this table. Whereas assaults account for 37% of the firearm-related deaths, they account for more than 3/4 of all non-fatal woundings that are treated in hospitals. What's also important to recognize is the great lethality of self-inflicted, these are suicide attempts. The vast majority of those do lead to death, and that's an area we're going to cover in some detail in the coming sessions. Unintentional shootings, conversely, are usually not lethal. So in conversations or debates about the importance of unintentional firearm shootings, if you only focus on the deaths, it looks like a very small portion, but they account for almost 1 in 5 injuries that are treated in hospitals. Let's now take a look at the overall trend since 1999 through 2017. Here again, you see that firearm suicides are far more common than firearm homicides throughout this entire period of study. And importantly, there's been a very steady increase in firearm suicides since 2006. So for more than a decade, we have been seeing increases in firearm suicide rates. The temporal pattern in firearm homicides is a little more complex, with some fluctuation, a decline that occurred actually beginning from 2006 through 2011. This is actually the years of the Great Recession, where you might expect that there is more gun violence, but there is actually less. That's a complicated thing to unravel. And then the other thing of note here is the particularly sharp increase in firearm homicides between the years 2014 and 2016. Here we're going to take a look at how fatal firearm violence varies by gender. And what is very obvious from this slide is that whether you're talking about homicides or suicides, males have far greater rates than do females, both with respect to victimization as well as offending. Indeed, if you look at homicide offending with firearms, 90% of the offenders are male, and nearly 90% of suicides are male. There's also important differences when you break down these major categories of firearm mortality based upon the race of victims and offenders. Here, what's quite notable is much higher rates for blacks compared to whites, with Native Americans being somewhat higher in victimization for homicides. If you look at suicides, however, it's a very different picture. Here you have whites having far and away the highest rates of suicides, followed by Native Americans. There's important differences in risk across the lifespan when you look at both firearm suicides and firearm homicides. In this graph, we looked at suicide victimizations with guns based upon the age of the victim. You'll note a very sharp increase during the adolescent years and young adult years, and then another period of increase in the middle part of life, and then from 60s into the 80s. Homicide victimization, however, looks quite different. Here, again, you do have a even more sharp increase in age-specific victimization rates during the adolescent years that peak around age 21, 22 years old, and then gradually decline as you get towards the 30s and 40s. Homicide offending rates look very similar. Again, you see a very sharp increase during the adolescent years, late adolescent years, peaking around age 21. And again, you see these declines into the 30s and 40s. So this is very important to keep in mind when we think about risk-based approaches to addressing firearm violence. We recognize that both with respect to offending and victimization, for homicides, the risks drop off considerably into the middle adult years, whereas suicide risks do the opposite. They increase. In this slide, we're simply looking at the percent of murders in which the suspect used a firearm, broken down by the age of the offender. The highest rates for using a firearm are teenagers, 12 to 17, followed shortly by young adults in the 18 to 24 age group. It's also noteworthy that this last category, in which the offender or suspect is unknown, these are unsolved murders, almost 90% involve firearms. This is typically, most likely, a phenomenon of gang-related violence, that those murders can be very difficult for police to solve for a range of reasons that also are important in thinking about the prevention of gun violence. Here's how things break down. We know that these adolescent and young adult years are very important periods of high risk, and this is how things break down when you look at things by race. Again, what stands out here is much higher rate for blacks compared to whites, with Hispanics having somewhat elevated rates compared to whites. We're going to be talking a lot about state firearm policies, so it's good to first begin thinking about how do firearm death rates vary across our 50 states. In this particular slide here, we're looking at firearm homicide rates for the years 2008 to 2014. What's very evident here is, again, just to make sure everybody's on the same page, the lowest rates for firearm homicide are the lighter shaded areas, and the highest rates are the darkest shades. There's a fairly clear geographic pattern here where the highest rates of firearm homicides are in the Southeast and parts of the Midwest, including Missouri, Illinois, and Michigan. States that have particularly low rates of firearm homicide are in the upper northern plains areas and New England. Now we're going to look at firearm suicide mortality across states. Again, the darkest shades represent the highest risk, and the lightest shades represent the lowest rates. Here are some of those same states that had relatively low rates of firearm homicides, particularly in the northern plains areas, have high rates of firearm suicides, as does states in the parts of the Southwest, Kentucky, and West Virginia as well. An important thing that explains the differences across these states in a subsequent session, we're going to be looking at how this breaks down with suicide and what explains the role of firearms in particular. But it's important to note that the risk for homicide and suicide varies depending upon the level of urbanization of a local area or a county. And in the states with the highest rates of firearm suicide, you also have the greatest portions of the population there living in rural or non-metro areas. So in this slide, you see that for suicides, there's a very clear gradation there of as you move away from the heaviest areas of urbanization towards more rural environments, you get higher rates of suicide. That there are also important differences in firearm ownership rates that we'll be talking about as well that explains that. Firearm homicide rates across urbanization is a little more complex, the highest rates being experienced in large central metropolitan counties. There's a broad literature showing that concentration of population is positively correlated with violent crime, and including homicide. It is noteworthy, however, that the rural areas' firearm homicide rates are not dramatically different from those of small metro area counties and large fringe metro area counties. So the idea that firearm homicides are not a problem in rural areas, I think, is not entirely accurate. Now, I wanted to take a minute to begin to explain why rates of firearm homicide are particularly high among blacks compared to whites. We could have a whole course on that easily, delving into reasons for racial disparities in violence. But I want to use what I think is a really helpful example, a study led by Sarah Jacoby and her colleagues at University of Pennsylvania. What she and her colleagues did is she looked at data going back to 1937 and a period in where the country is coming out of depression and the Roosevelt administration is trying to spur economic development, particularly with respect to housing. What happened is that they created a homeowners lending corporation that would indicate to banks and other financial investment organizations which areas had the highest rates of risk if you were going to lend to them, which of course affected lending and mortgage rates in fairly powerful ways. The blue and green shades were the safest risk. These were more affluent neighborhoods, and these were contrasted with the yellow and red zones. The yellow zone represented areas where there was some economic decline and influx of quote-unquote low-grade population. This typically meant immigrants and non-whites. The red zones were areas that had a lot of dilapidated housing, and again, this is language dating from these documents going back to 1937, undesirable population of blacks, immigrants, and Jews. So this is where the term redlining comes from, is exactly this type of policy. And what's really stunning and profound is how the effects of those housing policies dating back to 1937 still correlate with levels of disadvantage and subsequent gun violence. So here in this slide, the researchers are, in essence, first mapping out what these zones looked like, the zones dating from the housing investment risk zones from 1937, map onto the census tracts being in quadrant A in the upper left, and in the upper right, the B part of the quadrant is how the investment zones lined up. So here again, you can see very clearly that the areas of highest risk investment, the red zones, and the next level of highest risk being the yellow zones, these were concentrated mostly in the southern part of the city, whereas the northern and northwestern part of the cities were lower risk and therefore got more investment. So in the bottom two quadrants, quadrant C on the bottom left is the rates of firearm assaults within each of these census tracts. Here you see very clearly that the segments with the highest rates of firearm assaults, as well as the highest rates of violent crime overall, which you see in the bottom right in the D quadrant, are correlated quite strongly with these areas of investment designated in 1937. So just to wrap up, I want to make a few important comments. What I went over today is what we in public health refer to as the descriptive epidemiology of gun violence. How is gun violence distributed across a population? It's important to note that demographic correlates are only a beginning point for trying to understand the actual causes of gun violence, which are often quite complex. We saw very clearly that adolescence and young adulthood is a time of great risk, particularly for assaultive gun violence, and we'll have a special session that's focused specifically on some of the reasons for that, including important issues relevant to brain development, as well as social factors that relate to adolescents' position in our society. We also found quite profound differences for males versus females. Part of that is of physiological differences, but probably a lot of it has to do with differences in our cultural norms, both relevant to guns. Gun ownership and carrying is much more common among males and females, as well as the social powerful position of males traditionally in many contexts, and in essence sort of what it means to be male. And then finally, just as we were talking about when it comes to housing policy, there's a broad literature that basically tries to unpack the underlying conditions that are connected to racial disparities in violent crime, including gun violence. Much of those differences between blacks and whites are explained by social and economic disadvantages that are driven specifically by public policies like housing, as we just went through, as well as differences in the number of professional people in positions of professional employment that also impact marriage rates differently across races. And then finally, differences in how our legal system interacts with blacks versus whites that creates levels of cynicism about the legal system among blacks. So as we go forward in this course, we'll be very cognizant of the incredible burden of gun violence in the United States, whether you're talking about gun-related mortality, the bulk of which is suicides, or whether you're talking about morbidity, where 3/4 of our non-fatal gun violence treated in hospitals are assaults. It's important to recognize that the public health impacts of gun violence even go beyond these deaths and injuries that are easier to track. They have profound impact with respect to psychological trauma and fear that permeates throughout our society.